From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Today, K-State's Jenny Ifft will discuss how the USDA's Pasture, Rangeland and Forage Insurance coverage works and its performance as a risk management tool for livestock producers in times of drought. The deadline for enrolling in PRF coverage for 2022 is December the 1st. Also, K-State's Sarah Lancaster takes up two topics: strategies for controlling mustard weeds in wheat and other crop ground in the coming weeks, and her thoughts on adapting one's weed management to anticipated shortages and higher costs of certain popular herbicide products in 2022. Also ahead, K-State's Mike Brouk with another Milk Lines. All that coming up on Agriculture Today. Good to have you aboard once again for this Agriculture Today. So often we talk about risk management in agricultural production, and for you livestock producers, there is an opportunity for you to enhance your risk management, to put it that way, as far as your forage resources go. It's a program that the USDA put forth a few years ago, and there's an important deadline for enrolling in it coming up. We've invited by now an agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension who is expertise in risk management matters, Jenny Ifft, to talk about the USDA's Pasture, Rangeland and Forage Insurance program. Jenny, this was unveiled several years ago, and you might remind us of its purpose.
Right. So Pasture, Rangeland and Forage Insurance is for producers with hay or grazing acreage, and it makes payment when rainfall or precipitation falls below the historic average.
And that's it in a nutshell, really, as to what it's about.
Yep.
Let's talk, though, about risk management in general, because producers haven't necessarily engaged in this kind of insurance coverage in the past, but they are, as you stress, familiar with risk management as a concept.
Right. That's what I always say. Everybody manages risk. Even if you've been doing something for decades and it's worked well for you, and you may not think of it as risk management, you might not think of it as self-insurance, but it's still risk management. And so there's a lot of things a producer can control to manage risk. So you could think about forage quality, investing in that, investing in herd health. But there's some things that a producer cannot directly control, namely the markets and the weather. And that's where insurance comes into play. We had about 3.4 million acres of pasture or rangeland enrolled in PRF in 2021 in this year, which has been growing quite a bit. We had 500,000 acres added in the last year. So you can think a lot of growth. It's been growing over a long time. On the other hand, we may have about 15 million acres of pasture in Kansas. So there's some people that are using it and it's working for them, but there's a lot of producers that either don't know about it or just it doesn't fit into their management strategy.
Explain, if you would, and you touched upon the basic premise of it, but how it works and how it determines the coverage levels for a given producer based on, well, weather.
Right. So there's two big decisions a producer is going to have to make with PRF: coverage levels and the intervals. So we'll start with the coverage levels first. One way of thinking about coverage level is it's the opposite of a deductible. So if you have a deductible, say, for your car, and you go above $1,000 of losses, that's when you start getting insurance payments. So with coverage levels for PRF, you can select 70 to 90%, and that's the level that the index needs to go below to trigger a payment. So if you select a 90% coverage level, rainfall has to go below 90% of the historic average for you to get a payment. That payment's going to take you up to that difference. Same thing, 70%. If you select 70%, rainfall has to go below 70% of the historic average for you to get a payment. So if you think about coverage levels generally, higher coverage levels cost more, they pay out more. Lower coverage levels cost less, and they pay out less. So really, with coverage levels, you get what you pay for.
Right, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Need to plug in a very important detail, though, how rainfall levels are determined.
Yes.
And this is specific to official readings, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's weather stations all across the country. And this program uses those weather stations to measure rainfall within a grid. And those grids are preset. They're about 17 by 13 miles. It's approximate. But you have to use the grid that you're located in. Now, if you're overlapping grids, you can pick which grid you want, or you can split your coverage between the two grids. So if you have a big enough farm or you happen to be in a boundary, it can get a little bit complicated. But generally, you're going to be insuring for the specific grid that you're located. And rainfall is going to be measured for the entire grid over 2-month intervals. Now, we'll get to the intervals in a little bit, but the rainfall is going to be measured, and it's going to be relative to the historical index. That's what's going to matter for payouts.
The other side of it, though, is this interval matter, and
Yes.
that's the time frame during which your coverage will be effective.
Right. So you have to select at least 2 intervals, and intervals of 2 months. That's the period in which rainfall is measured and where it's determined whether or not you get a payout. So you have to select 2 intervals. An interval is 2 adjacent months. So January, February, March, June, July, November, December. So you have to select at least 2 of those. You could also cover the entire year. That's up to an individual producer. And it really depends on your management objectives, what you end up doing. So for the typical farm, a lot of the forage risk is going to be in the summer. That's when there's typically the most forage risk, but again, it's available throughout the year. Typically, what we've seen historically is that summer intervals tend to have lower premiums and lower expected indemnities. Winter intervals, on the other hand, have had higher premiums and higher expected indemnities. A lot of this has to do with the winter intervals having more volatility. Mm-hmm. So historically in the summer, it tends to be drier. So you might have a dry July, and it might not trigger just because July tends to be dry all of the time. So understanding the implications of selecting summer or winter intervals is very important, and it's something to sit down with a crop insurance agent with and make sure that you really, really understand those implications.
One of the reasons we are covering this today is there is a deadline for enrolling for 2022 coverage, and that's but a mere few weeks away, Jenny.
December 1st, yeah. Decision has to be made by December 1st.
And what a producer, again, is going to be zeroing in on would be the coverage level and those intervals.
Right, and I think that those are the 2 big choices, but there's another thing that's really important to understand, and we touched on it with the grids. And so the one thing I've heard since coming into Kansas is that in my field I can have a lot of rain and my neighbor gets nothing, or the opposite. It's the same thing with PRF. And so you can have really dry conditions or wet conditions that don't match your local area. So you don't always get a payment when you face dry conditions. Of course, the opposite can happen as well, right? You might be fine but still get a payment because of the conditions of your grid. So that's a type of risk as well that a producer needs to understand. How close does my experience match the grid? And maybe also try to get an understanding of how often those have been different historically.
To help an individual grasp how this program might work for them, there are actually tools online that they can look at historical trends and see what the program might have done in past years.
Yeah, the USDA has a tool that's really easy to use, and I think a lot of crop insurance agents have their own that are similar. You really just have to enter in your intervals, your coverage level, and you can change those. It's something you can experiment with. And you can see the rainfall index. And over the past 2 or 3 decades, you can see the rainfall index for the entire year over your grid. So you can go back and you can say, can my experience match with that? And then you could also see the expected indemnities and what your historic indemnities would have been. So what years would have I gotten payouts? I mean, you could even go back into your production or financial records and think about, would have that helped me? How would have that changed my management decisions?
So doing that research, if you will, could be very helpful to producers in deciding whether or not to take part in this coverage. How you see, Jenny, this changing the drought management approach that producers might have? You had some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think my understanding of drought management for cow-calf producers, for cattle producers more broadly in Kansas, the way this is done is, first of all, you keep a pretty high inventory forage. I've even heard up to a year. I think it's less for some people, but you want to be able to feed your cattle during a drought. That has a cost, obviously, if you're holding more forage. It costs to produce it, and quality can go down over time. You also have producers that'll sell cows or calves, which helps in the short term with your cash flow. If you can't feed them, In the long term, it might take longer to build your herd back up. So the question is, if you get these payments in a drought year, can you maybe hold a little bit less inventory? Can you maybe hold on to a few more cows? Or maybe this is just something that will help with your family living expenses if you're not having as much income as you expected from cattle, or say even renting out grazing land. So that's sort of the management question. How would extra indemnities help change my management strategy for my farm operation if I had those?
And what you're doing in saying that is encouraging producers to study this carefully. They've time yet. The deadline is again December the 1st, but use the tools online. Think about their situation, their drought management in the past when times have gotten a little tough in terms of forage availability. Mesh all of that together and come up with a decision on participation.
Yep. I think definitely understand the management implications and understand how the program works, especially, again, because there's a risk that you don't get a payment when your own experience is different than your local area. And so that's something you really have to understand, or you could be disappointed pretty quickly with this product.
Loads of information on this program out there, including the rma.usda.gov website. Learn more about the USDA's Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage Insurance coverage, the decisions required for participation, as well as how it might perform as part of your overall risk management approach, producers. But again, the deadline for enrolling for 2022 coverage is not long away at all, December the 1st. Jenny, thank you for going over all of this. Appreciate it. Jenny Ifft, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. This is Agriculture Today. We'll have more on the K-State Radio Network. Welcome back to This Agriculture Today. Well, weed control is almost a 12-month-a-year consideration for you crop producers, and there are a lot of new questions that have arisen about accomplishing that as we head into 2022. Sarah Lancaster is along. She is a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. To the pressing matters at hand, though, Sarah, mustards are prominent in wheat and possibly other places out there right now. Control would be something to think about around this time, you say.
That's right, Eric. One of the things that can be easy to overlook in terms of weed control in general is the role of application timing in terms of weed size, right? And so mustards are a group of weeds where that timing piece is really important because while they're rosettes and while they're smaller, they're relatively easy to control, but once we get to spring and those mustards have started to bolt and flower, then control becomes much more difficult. So if you have fields where you know you have a history of problems with mustards, it's probably time to start thinking about, what you're going to do there.
And can producers go after mustards right up to freezing, or what's the time window here?
Now is a good time to do that, Eric. The big thing is making sure that those plants are actively growing so that they're going to take in the herbicides and they're going to metabolize those herbicides. The other factor there is going to be wheat size, wheat growth stage, right? So some of the products, maybe aren't so well suited for an application this fall, especially if we had some later planted wheat.
The good thing about dealing with mustards is there is a wide array of products that can get this job done in the fall.
That is true, Eric. So, when we talk wheat herbicides, kind of the starting point there are those group 2 or ALS inhibiting herbicides. And there are several herbicides from that mode of action that can work on mustard. So, things like Glean, Ally, Olympus would be sort of newer, not new anymore, but newer than the other two, product that could help with mustard control in the fall. Of course, when we start thinking about those ALS inhibiting products that have residual activity, like the Glean or the Ally, we have to be careful about thinking about crop rotations, right? So having that plan for what you're going to come back with, especially in terms of double cropping, but even, that next cropping season is going to be something that folks are going to want to sit down and think through before they make that decision.
But Group 2 products aren't the only options here, are they?
They're not. And one of the reasons that we need to look at things other than Group 2 products is that, Dallas several years ago did identify some populations of particularly blue mustard comes to mind that are resistant to those Group 2 products. So obviously that's not going to be an effective solution for folks in certain areas of the state. So other things to think about, probably the next sort of go-to, there would be those Group 4 herbicides like 2,4-D and dicamba. Culex is another Group 4 herbicide that folks could look at as well. The thing there that we need to talk about, though, particularly with 2,4-D, is the importance of application timing in terms of growth stage on the wheat. Just making sure that you're not going to inhibit tillering by applying that 2,4-D too early.
One finer point here, Group 27 herbicides, Group 4 herbicides, you say their residual activity is limited, and that's something to factor in here.
Yeah, so, we think about things like Group 4 herbicides like 2,4-D, Group 27 herbicides like Husky, that would probably be the main one that we're thinking about here. They don't have any residual activity, right? So you've got to think about, how you're going to time that in terms of when do you think you're going to have most of that flush of weeds up. So again, that balancing act that folks do all the time between weed size and, the extent of the emergence that we've seen thus far. So just some things to keep in mind if you do decide to go with the route of a Group 4 or Group 27. The other thing I would say is that most of those products can be mixed together, just herbicide resistance management and broadening the spectrum of weed control. If you're in a situation where your yield potential will allow that extra cost, probably a good idea to think about some tank mixes.
So again, watching that wheat develop, take a look and see if mustards are starting to sprout in those stands and treat accordingly this fall. Get the jump on those mustard species. Want to take this up, though, Sarah, because you're having this conversation with just about everybody, producers, economists, fellow agronomists, about how to handle what's perceived and expected in the way of shortage of herbicide product and expensive product at that as we roll into another growing season. This is worrisome for a lot of folks.
Eric, our crop producers, gosh, they've got some tough decisions to make here this winter and thinking about how they're going to manage things coming into the spring. The big story is that we are anticipating shortages, significant shortages of glyphosate and glufosinate for 22. And I will go ahead and say this, Eric, some of the distributors that I've talked with actually are talking about the situation not being cleared up already by 23. So, as we think about this is something new for producers to have to handle. We had some hiccups last summer, but this is going to be a larger scale we're anticipating. And I think the other thing to say here about it is that, yeah, we're going to have to put some Band-Aids on things, but we also need to think about how are we going to change how we do business to survive in these settings where we don't have the herbicides we need, or even, as we look, I don't know how long down the road, but years down the road, Eric, when our post-emergence herbicides just plain quit working because of herbicide resistance, these next couple summers are actually kind of opportunities to practice for that in terms of thinking about how can we take the pressure off of those post-emergence products to perform.
Tack to take here, then. Producers are going to be trying to economize on their applications without compromising their weed control. Are there strategies for getting that done?
Probably the place to start is to think about your application equipment. I know a lot of folks rely on custom applicators to make their applications. And so, maybe this comment applies to the custom applicators right. as well. But just thinking about how do I need to maintain my equipment? How do I need to adjust my equipment and my application practices so that I am giving those post-emergence herbicides every possible chance to do what they need to do? So, things as routine as going through and checking your nozzles, making sure they're all in good working order, nothing's plugged, just make that a daily practice, not just getting the machine set up at the beginning of the season, but make it a daily practice. Maybe even you want to think about driving speed. I know there's a lot of economic trade-offs in terms of work rates and such when we think about lowering that driving speed. But when you drop that driving speed, what you're doing is allowing more of your herbicide to hit the intended target. There's less off-target movement, less drift. Another thing that's super important, especially as we think about Liberty or glufosinate, is thinking about how much water you're going to use for your application. And again, I know that's an efficiency factor there that guys have to weigh very heavily, but a little bit of water can go a long way in terms of spray volume, just going from 10 or 12 up to 15 or 18, especially with Liberty, can make a difference in efficacy. And that's super important when we think about the fact that we might only have one shot at a Liberty application this summer.
Beyond applications, though, are there other things that can be taken on to make the most of what's available in the way of herbicides, thinking cultural practices or agronomic practices?
The first thing I want to talk about there, Eric, is the fact that we as extension specialists are admittedly a little preachy about pre-emergence herbicides. But as we think about ways to take the pressure off of those post products, having a solid pre-emergence herbicide program that includes multiple effective modes of action, especially for things like our pigweeds, but also some of these things that we've been seeing kind of slip through the cracks the last few years, can be super important. If I were after that, kind of easy, low-hanging fruit of checking your application equipment, the next thing that folks need to start looking at kind of across the board would be how are they going to beef up their pre-emergence herbicide program for spring of 22? Because we're going to need it out there. It's not 1997 anymore. The Roundup isn't going to be there. And even if it was, for a lot of cases, it just doesn't cut it anymore as far as giving us the weed control that we need.
This may be, Sarah, a sea change in weed control. Circumstances are lining up that's where producers are heading into 2022.
Yeah, Eric, I think there's a silver lining in everything, right? And so maybe one of the best things to come from this is to look at it as an opportunity to make ourselves better weed managers. Everything we can do to make that crop more competitive is going to pay dividends. Optimizing planting dates, optimizing seeding rates, seeding depth, fertility, which is another terrible subject for 22. It sounds crazy, Eric, but we've been looking at work with things like weed electrocution and other things that 20 years ago we had kind of, as conventional agronomists, had kind of set aside and said that's for the organic people. Mm-hmm. Those things are coming into play now for us because we need to make sure that we're managing escapes, right? We're not relying solely on those technologies, but we're starting to look at them as potential tools in the toolbox to reduce deposition to the weed seed bank. And that's going to be so important going forward, especially as we think about trying not to lose the battle against things like our pigweeds.
Good comments to pass along to producers right here, Sarah, as we're heading into the off-season now, but with opportunity here to reformulate whatever weed management approach a producer has in mind heading into 2022 production. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks for the invitation.
She's a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, is Sarah Lancaster. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and in a moment, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Before that, in that the harvest is winding down in Kansas, thought we might pass along to you this week's USDA Crop Progress and Condition Report to give you an idea of how close we are to tying off this 2021 harvest and how well that new winter wheat crop is doing. For the week ending this past Sunday, our top soil moisture supplies in Kansas, 4% surplus, 65% adequate, and 31% at short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 3% surplus, 60% adequate, 37% short to very short. Kansas winter wheat is called 62% good to excellent, 31% fair, 7% poor to very poor, with emergence now at 80% statewide. Now, the corn harvest, 93% complete. That's very near average. Soybean harvest at 79% in, again near the average. And the sorghum harvest is 78% complete. That's actually ahead of the 73% average for the date. Cotton harvest, 17% near average. And the sunflower harvest is at 82%, well ahead of the 67% average there. This week's numbers on crop conditions from the USDA. On to Milk Lines now, where K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk is encouraging you dairy producers to take your employee relations to another level. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers about employee retention on your dairies. We live in very difficult times, and trying to keep labor on dairy farms is no different than any other place around the United States. So what are some things that you can do as a dairy producer to keep your dairy employees on your farm? Some things you might consider are pay. Are you actually keeping up with where the competition is? You know, if you haven't actually looked around to see what other people are paying for labor these days, you probably need to do that. I realize dairy margins are very tight and that you may not have a lot of room in your budget for additional labor cost. However, you may need to consider this as an option if you wish to retain some of the employees that you have on your dairy. This could be straight pay. It could also be incentive programs, and talking to your dairy employees about how they would like to see that administered might be an important thing, particularly those employees that are key employees on the dairy, and trying to understand what kind of pay that they think they should be receiving for the work that they're doing. Secondly, you know, a lot of times it's really not about pay, and sometimes I think we forget that. A lot of it has to do with communication. It also has to do with recognition. So, I have a question for you. When was the last time you just sat down with your employee or employees, either individually or as a group, and just listened? Maybe join them for lunch, or maybe plan an evening activity where they bring their families in and you actually enjoy some time together. Regular meetings about the operation are really, really important. Are they there just to work, or are they part of the management team? How do you show that you actually value them? You know, sometimes we get really busy with a lot of other details and we just simply forget to say thank you. Adding that to your vocabulary as you visit with employees is very, very important. Recognition of jobs done well, recognition of progress toward learning new skills, all of those things are very, very important in trying to keep employees motivated, but also keeping them on your dairy farm. Even though we have some very challenging times during the current situation, we need to understand that there are things that we can do to encourage our employees. We need to do those things if we expect them to continue to work on our dairies. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. On tomorrow's broadcast from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McGowan on the tax rules regarding prepaid farm expenses and more. Be tuned in for that, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson, thanking you for joining us here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.